Hi, my name is Scott, and this video was made for photographers who would like to try video but don't know where to start. So the first part is very basic, but then we get into setting up your camera, how video and photography are different, and finally a little bit about 4K. So here we go, Video 101. First, set the mode dial on your camera to the green square. Next, switch to video. This is a Canon, and a Nikon, and a Sony. Now we need to focus. Not every camera or camera and lens combination will support autofocus, so you may need to check your camera manual. You can always use manual focus or go back to step one, focus as if you were taking a photo, and then switch back to video. Next, push the start button. This is a Canon, and a Nikon, and a Sony. You may be able to reprogram your shutter button so that it also starts your video. Look for the little red dot to light up. That shows that your camera is recording. Now that you've recorded your first video, you can import the file like any other photo. If you use Lightroom, you can do some basic edits. You can adjust exposure, white balance, contrast. You can trim it. Grab a frame and export the finished product just like a picture. It's that easy. Well, we're still on the green square, but there's one more thing we should look at before we go any further, and that is frame rate versus shutter speed. Video is a series of still pictures played back fast. The number of pictures taken in 1 second is the frame rate, or frames per second. You can set this. The time that the shutter is open to take each individual picture, or frame, is the shutter speed. You can also set this. Frames per second and shutter speed are two different things. They are set separately. Remember, 1/60th of a second is not the same as 60 frames per second. This can be confusing. Here's an example. When I was putting this together as a slideshow for my camera club, I got this email from B&H Photo. It's a tutorial promotion for the Panasonic GH5, and it's on the subject of using frame rates creatively. So I still haven't figured out how they knew I was working on this. Maybe it was just a coincidence. It starts by talking about shutter speed. I thought, wait a minute, shouldn't that be frame rate? So I bookmarked the page, and when I came back to it 2 days later, they had changed shutter speed to frame rate. So the lesson here is that it's okay to be confused as long as you know you're confused. Anyhow, if you can keep frame rate versus shutter speed straight, you're ready to set up your camera. You don't need to take your camera off the green square, but at some point you'll probably want to take more control over your work. You have the same choices of shooting mode that you do in photography, but you should pick either manual or shutter priority. Why not aperture? Because you don't want the camera to choose your shutter speed. That's one thing that you want to pick yourself. Manual gives you the most control, but there are times when shutter priority is the better choice. For example, suppose that you're taking cat videos in your backyard and your kitten runs under the picnic table. All of a sudden, it's 2 stops darker, but your camera can make this adjustment instantly. You will also need to choose a frame rate. Typically, these will be your choices from North America. 24 frames per second is traditional for cinema. 30 frames per second is the standard frame rate for North American television. A lot of wildlife photographers will use 60 frames per second because it allows them to make slow motion, and they can use a faster shutter speed and still have smooth video. 120 frames per second is used if you intend to make slow motion. Once you've chosen a frame rate, you'll need to set the shutter speed. The rule of thumb for shutter speed is that it should be twice the frame rate. For example, if you're at 30 frames per second, you need 1/60th of a second shutter speed. There are times when you would break this rule of thumb. For instance, normally if you're shooting 30 frames per second, you would be at 1/60th of a second. You can drop that shutter speed down to 1/30th of a second and gain that much light. You may choose to use higher shutter speeds if you're shooting for frame grabs or to make special effects. Shutter speed combines with frame rate to produce the look of a movie. The classic example is the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. This was shot with a fast shutter speed in order to give it an edgy look. If you're interested in looking it up, search for Saving Private Ryan shutter angle. Here are two examples of using non-standard shutter speeds. The first is a video of Northern Lights shot at 1/30th of a second. This is not a time lapse, it's real-time video played back at the actual speed. The second clip is of a bike race where I used 1/500th of a second just to see how it would look. Now for the really boring stuff. NTSC versus PAL. NTSC is the video standard for North American TV. Some other parts of the world use PAL. You should be able to use whatever standard that your camera was set on when you bought it. MOV versus MP4. These are containers rather than compression. They don't really affect the way your video looks. Your camera will have different options depending on which one you pick. I usually end up with MOV. Resolution and compression. Full high definition or 1080p is the industry high def standard. This is the same resolution as the original Blu-ray. All-I versus IPB. These are types of compression used by Canon. If you are editing frame by frame, you should pick All-I. Otherwise, you would hardly notice the difference. This is part of the menu for a Canon camera. You'd first have to pick NTSC, choose your movie quality, I'm picking MOV. When you get to this screen, you're setting three things at once: your resolution, your frames per second, and your compression. Same thing on a Nikon menu. Once you have your settings the way you want them, you should save them if it's at all possible. Canon has custom functions, and if you can save your settings to a custom function, it will be a lot easier the next time you want to shoot video. How is photography different from video? If you've been studying photography, most of what you know will make you a better videographer, but there are some ways that shooting video is different. The first is that you often have too much light, especially outdoors. You may need to use a neutral density filter or polarizer to bring your aperture down to where you want it. Steadiness is even more important in video. You may be able to handhold at shorter focal lengths, but you won't be able to handhold your 500mm lens. You will need a tripod. Also, you are not shooting RAW. Your camera may be set to RAW for photos, but your videos will be something closer to a JPEG. This means you'll have to try a little harder to get it right in the camera, especially with your exposure and white balance. Be careful shooting video of a sunrise. Nobody is going to be pixel peeping your video. Remember that even 4K is only about 8 megapixels. This means that you don't need a lens that resolves 30 megapixels. Your kit lens is probably fine. Finally, no do-overs. I know that in photography there are lots of times when you only have one chance to make the shot, but in video, it's worse. Once you press the record button, you can't change your mind about the framing or location or exposure without making a huge problem for yourself. So, think about your setup ahead of time, then resist the urge to second-guess yourself. Finally, what about 4K? 4K is a big deal right now. I just Googled fantastic 4K video and got over 11 million hits. Just remember that the important thing is how your video looks to the viewer. There are a lot of things that go into the appearance of a video, including the following. Basically, everything that goes into making a good photo. Note that focus is in there twice. Assuming that your camera shoots 1080p, every one of these things is more important than more resolution. In fact, if you're shooting 4K, these things become even more important because any flaws will be magnified. So, take whatever camera you have and shoot some fantastic video. So that was Video 101. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.